Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1883, the wind dragged grit across the high plains. And as the town of Elk Hollow stirred awake, 24-year-old Vienna James was already walking barefoot down the dirt road, a worn carpetbag clutched in one hand and her ribs aching from the night before. She did not look back. Behind her sat the white clapboard house her father had built with his own hands, the same house where he slammed the door in her face just hours ago. All because she had loved the wrong man, a man who turned out to be married, a man who had whispered lies and left her reputation in ruin. A man she had believed in until the moment his wife cornered her outside church with a voice like a blade. "You come near him again, and I will have your name carved into every saloon wall from here to Cheyenne." Vienna had not spoken. She had nothing left to say. Her mother had passed 3 winters ago, and her father never did have much room in his heart for anything that did not fit into a church pew clean and quiet, so she walked. Out past the livery, past the general store where Mrs. Gibbons turned her face away, and out of town altogether. She did not cry. Not until she reached the ridge above Elk Hollow and saw the town spread below small, simple, and now behind her forever. By nightfall, her feet were blistered, and she could barely breathe from the cold. The wind cut sharp through her coat as she huddled beneath a lone pine tree. The stars above blinked down like they did not care at all, and then came the sound of hooves. She did not move. If it was a bounty hunter or someone worse, she had nothing worth taking anyway, but the horse slowed. A man dismounted. "You all right?" His voice was low, steady. Not kind exactly, but not cruel either. She blinked up, heart thudding. He stood tall, maybe 30, with a leather duster and a rifle slung across his back. His dark blonde hair curled at the edges beneath his hat, and his eyes searched her face without judgment. "I am fine," she lied softly. "You are barefoot in the dirt with no fire. That ain't fine." He crouched, setting down a small pack. "Name's Dax Zimmerman. I am headed north to my ranch. You got somewhere to be?" Vienna hesitated. No, he looked her over again, not the way other men had, not like she was something to measure or claim, but like he was figuring out how much pain she was in. "Come on," he said after a moment. "Let me at least get you warm." "I do not want anything from a man," she said quickly, voice shaking. He nodded once like he understood, then stood. "All right, I will build the fire over there. You can sit close or not, up to you." And he did exactly that. Built a fire 10 paces away, did not push her for answers, just unpacked a tin of beans and waited in silence. She watched him for a long time before edging closer. "I am Vienna," she whispered. He handed her a tin cup without looking up. "Well, Vienna, you are welcome to ride with me come morning. I got a spare horse and no one waiting on me." She wrapped her hands around the warm metal. "Why would you help me?" He leaned back, eyes on the fire. "Because I know what it feels like to be cast out." She did not ask more that night. By dawn, she was on the back of a dun mare named Dusty, her bag tied behind the saddle. They rode north together, the prairie opening wide with every mile. He did not ask what happened to her. He did not tell her what he had lost, but the silence between them was not empty. It was easy. They reached his land 2 days later, a modest spread tucked between cottonwoods and craggy hills, with a wide barn and a small house that leaned a little to one side. Everything about it felt honest. "I built it with my brother," he said, helping her down. "He died last year, snakebite. I took to keeping things simple since." Vienna followed him into the house. The walls were rough-hewn pine, the air smelled of coffee and saddle soap. It felt more like safety than anything she had known in months. "You can stay here as long as you want," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee that first morning. "No rules, no debts, just help where you can. You do not even know me. I do not need to." And he meant it. Over the next weeks, Vienna found a rhythm. She fed the chickens, learned to patch torn saddle straps, cooked meals that Dax swore tasted better than anything he had made himself. He never asked her to explain the bruises along her ribs or why she flinched when he came too close. He simply saw her and gave space. He laughed sometimes. A quiet laugh, but it warmed the whole room when it came. He told her about the time he tried to break a wild Mustang and landed flat in the river. She told him about her mother's apple pie, about how she used to sing while kneading dough, and little by little, She started to smile again. One late afternoon, after fixing the barn door together, she leaned against the frame and watched him work. "You really do not care what I have done?" she asked. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "No," he said. "I care who you are now." She swallowed hard. "And what if I do not know who I am anymore?" He stepped closer, slow, careful. "Then we figure it out, together." The words made something crack open inside her. That night she dreamed of a life not bound by shame or running. And in the days that followed, she began to believe it might be possible, because in Dax's eyes she saw no judgment, only steadiness, only care, and maybe, just maybe, something more. The creek behind the barn ran quiet in the early evening, its banks soft with spring runoff. Vienna knelt at the edge, sleeves rolled high, scrubbing a shirt of Dax's against the flat stone he'd pointed out 2 days earlier. Her hands were red from cold water, but the rhythm steadied her. A shadow fell long across the creek. She didn't flinch, just looked up. "You don't have to do my wash," Dax said. He was holding a coil of rope in one hand, his hat pushed back farther than usual. "I can manage my own shirts." Vienna wrung the shirt out, laying it across a sapling branch. "I like doing something with my hands." He stepped closer, the rope trailing behind him. "I was thinking," he said after a pause, "about setting some boards along the north fence. Elk have been nosing through. If you're feeling steady, I'd take the help." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I can hammer a nail straight." They walked in silence past the oat field, gold green in the lowering light. The north fence was older, weather warped. A few rails had gone soft with rot. Dax pulled a hammer from his belt, handed it to her. "I'll hold." "You drive." She took it without a word, lined the nail, and struck. The wood gave a clean sound, and he nodded once, satisfied. After the third rail, he leaned against a post. "You ever think about what comes next?" She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "I try not to." "I mean after this, after surviving whatever you had to survive." Vienna set the hammer down. "I haven't figured that far. I thought maybe I'd just stay moving until the past couldn't catch up." He crouched to fit a new board into place. "Running don't always mean you're going forward." She didn't answer right away. The wind stirred her hair loose from its braid. "I guess I haven't known what it meant to stay." He drove the last nail in himself, then looked up. "You don't owe me anything, Vienna." "You know that, I know. Then stay because you want to." That night, she found herself watching him from the doorway as he oiled the hinges on the barn doors. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he'd learned the value of not rushing. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "I used to think if I could just be good enough, I'd be safe," she said quietly. He didn't turn around. "And now, I'm starting to think it's not about being good, just about being honest." He set the oil can down and faced her. "I'd take honest over good any day." She stepped out into the night air. "You really don't care who I was." "I care who you are when you're not afraid." Vienna felt her throat tighten. He walked past her, slow and quiet, and paused at the door. "You're welcome in the house, but if you ever want a key to the barn, I'll hang one by the east stall, in case you ever need space." She blinked at him. "You'd give me that. I'd give you what you ask for." "Not what I think you should want." When he left her there under the stars, she stood a long while with her arms wrapped around herself. The wind was picking up. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called out. Inside, she lit the lamp and sat by the hearth. Her hands were raw from the fence work, and her back ached, but she felt more solid than she had in months. She didn't cry, she didn't pray, but she whispered thank you under her breath, not to anyone in particular, just for the quiet, for the steadiness. For the man who didn't ask her to explain herself, and the place that didn't ask her to disappear. The spring rains came late that year, but when they did, they came hard. For 3 days, the sky hung low and gray, and the roof over Dax's kitchen let in a slow drip that pattered into a tin cup Vienna had placed beneath it. She patched what she could with boiled flour glue and scrap cloth, but the storm didn't care much for her efforts. On the 4th morning, the wind let go. Dax found her on the back porch, hauling damp firewood from under the eaves. "You're going to twist your back lifting those like that." Vienna didn't straighten. "I was carrying sacks of flour by the time I was 14. "I'll manage." He stepped down beside her, took the heavier logs without a word, and walked them inside. She followed, brushing wet hair from her face. Creeks likely swelled over, he said as he set the wood by the hearth. I'll check the fencing near the draw today. You can stay back if you want. Road'll be mud to the knees. I want to come. He studied her for a moment. I don't mean to test you. You're not. I want to see what it looks like when something holds after a storm. They rode out just after midday when the clouds had thinned to a pale whisper and the ground steamed. Vienna kept pace beside him, her hem soaked through but her hands steady on the reins. The draw cut low through the north end of the pasture, where cottonwoods crowded the banks. A section of fence had leaned out, half lifted by the water. Dax dismounted and crouched along the edge, his boots sinking in. Could have been worse. Rails are loose but not gone. Vienna stood behind him, watching the current pull at the grass. When I was little, I used to think rivers could carry you somewhere clean. Far enough and you wouldn't be yourself anymore. He didn't look up. And now, I think if you float too long, you forget how to stand. He ran a hand along the soaked wood. You haven't forgotten. They worked in silence, bracing the fence with split cedar and packing the base with stones. By late afternoon, the sky had warmed enough to dry their sleeves, and the water had dropped an inch. Vienna leaned on the post beside him. That man I thought I loved, he used to say I was too serious, that I carried things too far. Dax pressed a rail into place. He ever carry anything for you? No. Then he never earned the right to say a damn thing. She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. You talk like you've had your own reckoning. He stood and dusted off his hands. I married once. Vienna felt her heart still. You've never said. It wasn't long. I was 21, she was 19. We were good at pretending we were in love, but bad at everything else. She left before the first frost. Why? He looked out at the trees. Said she couldn't breathe out here. Said I was too quiet. Vienna stepped closer, the fence between them. You are quiet, I know. I don't mind it. His eyes met hers across the rail, and for a moment neither of them moved. A breeze lifted the edge of her shawl, and she didn't brush it down. When he reached across and caught the fabric before it flew, his fingers hovered at her shoulder. She didn't pull back. I like knowing you're still here when I turn around, she said. I'm not going anywhere. They didn't kiss, not yet. Just stood there, the two of them, with mud on their boots and wind in their hair and something in the air that felt like the beginning of a promise. They rode back slow, the sun dipping low behind the hills. At the barn, Dax swung down first and offered her a hand. When she took it, his touch lingered just long enough for her to notice. That night, after supper, she lingered by the fire, threading yarn through an old needlepoint hoop she'd found in the bottom drawer of the kitchen hutch. Dax sat across from her, bootless, reading a page-worn copy of Plutarch that had belonged to his brother. The silence between them was different now, not just easy, but full of something tender, waiting. I've never had a home that wasn't tied to fear, she said quietly, still watching her stitches. He didn't lift his eyes. Then maybe it's time to build one that isn't. Her hand slowed over the cloth. She didn't speak again that night, but she didn't sleep in the barn either. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth as June settled in, the mornings cool enough for breath to fog on the porch rail but warm by noon. Vienna sat with her sleeves rolled, oiling the hinges of the window shutters. The old house creaked softly behind her, boards shifting with the heat. Dax was outside the paddock, coaxing a stubborn roan into taking the bit. He never raised his voice, just moved with a kind of quiet patience that made the horse eventually lower its head. When she set the oil tin aside, she walked toward him, wiping her hands on a rag. That one's got a mind of her own. Most worth knowing do, he said, brushing the dust from his palms. She leaned against the gate, watching the horse chew at the bit. You ever think about selling off some of the herd? He looked up. Not unless I have to. Why? Because I've been thinking about starting a garden, but the goats keep getting into the clearing behind the smokehouse. He gave a short nod. I can run a fence line up there. You thinking vegetables, beans, squash, maybe onions if the soil's soft enough. I used to help my mother in the spring. We'd save the onion skins for dye. Dax rested a hand on the gate. I've got cedar posts in the shed. We can set them tomorrow. She hesitated. Only if you let me dig the holes. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Deal? That evening, she walked out alone past the tree line, her skirt brushing against pale wildflowers that pushed up through the grass. A pair of sandhill cranes rose from the marsh near the lower pasture, their wings like gray silk against the pale sky. She knelt near a patch of dark soil, pressed her hand to it, still cool, still damp. But rich. When she returned to the house, Dax was seated at the table with a leather-bound ledger open in front of him. He glanced up as she came through the door. "I didn't know you kept records," she said, brushing dirt from her palms. He closed the book. "Helps me sleep knowing what's owed and what's mine. You keep it all in your head during the day." He shook his head. "Used to. My brother kept the books. I just followed his numbers." Vienna pulled off her shawl and hung it by the door. "I could help with that if you ever need fresh eyes." His gaze lingered on her, unreadable for a moment, then he nodded once. "I'd like that." She sat across from him, her fingers tracing the grain in the table wood. "You ever think about what this place will be in 10 years? Sometimes, mostly when the roof leaks or the herd runs lean. I meant more, who will be here? What kind of life might grow between these walls?" He leaned back in the chair, arms folded. "That depends on who wants to stay." Her breath caught before she could stop it. "I do." He didn't answer right away. Just rose, crossed the small space between them, and gently reached for her hand. She let him. His fingers were warm, calloused, real. "I've been careful not to want too much," he said quietly. "But you're here, every morning, every night, and I keep hoping you'll still be here come fall." "I will." He lifted her hand without hurrying and pressed it to his chest. "Then this whatever it is we've built, I want it to hold. I want to make it more." The oil lamp flickered then, casting soft gold across the floorboards. Vienna stepped closer, resting her forehead lightly against his shoulder. "You already have." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in years she let herself be held, not as someone to be rescued or hidden or forgiven, but simply as herself. They didn't speak again that night, not with words. But when he led her to the bed, they'd both risen from alone for too long. Her fingers didn't tremble. And when she woke with his arm curled around her waist and the sky turning pale outside the window, she didn't feel small. She felt chosen. And for once, she felt ready to stay. The summer sun hung high as Dax and Vienna worked side by side in the clearing behind the smokehouse, staking the final post of the garden fence. The earth had turned soft under their care, rows already marked for planting. Vienna wiped her brow with the edge of her sleeve, stepping back to admire the clean lines of the boundary. Dax drove the last nail, then stood straight, rolling his shoulders. "Looks like it might hold." She glanced over at him. "It will." "We built it right." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her longer than the fence. "You've made things steadier here." The words settled between them like warm soil. She didn't answer right away, just moved toward the basket of seeds she'd wrapped in cloth and kept tucked under the porch. When she returned, she crouched beside the first row and began pressing beans into the dirt, careful to space them evenly. Dax knelt beside her after a moment. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Vienna didn't stop planting, but her hand slowed. "I thought we were already in it." "We are," he said, "but I mean making it official, you and me." She looked over at him, her fingers resting on the earth. "You asking me something, Dax Zimmerman?" "I am." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn ring. The silver was dulled with age, thin along the edges. "My mother's. I've had it since she passed. I was waiting on the right woman." Vienna sat back on her heels, staring at the ring. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since the first time you didn't flinch when I said nothing at all. I don't want a wedding for show, just you, me, and the land we built this on." She took the ring, turned it over in her palm. "Then yes." They married 3 days later beneath the cottonwoods behind the barn. Dax shaved and wore a clean shirt. Vienna stitched a ribbon into her hair that had belonged to her mother. The circuit preacher who passed through town every third Sunday agreed to come early and said the words with his hat in hand, standing in the shade as 2 witnesses from the neighboring ranch nodded their approval. There was no feast, just a warm loaf of bread and a jar of strawberry jam that Vienna had traded for at the mercantile. They ate it on the porch, plates in their laps, the wind soft and full of crickets. As the weeks passed, the garden took root. Vienna spent long mornings tending to it, knees dusted with soil, fingers stained green. Dax mended what needed mending, took the horses out early and came back smelling of sun and sweat. They moved through the days without rush but with purpose. One evening she stood at the stove, stirring onions in a cast iron skillet, when Dax came in carrying a wooden crate. "Found something," he said, setting it on the table. Behind the shed, buried under the old hay rack, Vienna wiped her hands and came over. Inside the crate were tools wrapped in oilcloth, a pair of leather-bound books, a carpenter's square, a chisel, and beneath it all, a folded piece of parchment. Dax unfolded it slowly. "My brother's handwriting." She stepped behind him to read over his shoulder. "Schematics. A plan for building a second room off the main house, with notations in the margins about winter insulation, stove placement, and shelves for books." Vienna touched the edge of the paper. "You think he meant to build it for his family? I think he never got the chance. Do you want to?" Dax looked at her, eyes steady. "Only if you'll help me pick the paint color." She laughed then, soft and sure. "I'll even help you build it." They started that fall, measuring out the space with string and stakes, clearing brush and hauling beams. The work was slow but sure, just like them. When the first snow fell, Vienna reached for Dax's hand as they stood in the doorway of the half-finished room, the roof raised but walls still open to the sky. He held her fingers gently, his thumb brushing the worn edge of the silver ring she now wore every day. "I used to think quiet meant loneliness," she said, "but this is peace." Dax leaned down, kissed her temple. "This is home." Years passed, the house grew with them. A second room, then a third, wide enough for a cradle. In time, they had a daughter named Clara, with Dax's steady eyes and Vienna's sharp jaw. They taught her how to ride before she could read, how to plant beans deep enough to take root, how to be kind without being soft. The garden fed them through each season. The horses grew old and were replaced. Neighbors came and went, but the house held, solid through storms, warm through winters. Vienna lined the shelves with jars of preserves and books she read aloud by hearthlight. Dax built chairs that would last longer than either of them. They never left the land. They never needed to. And every night when the lamps were turned low and the wind moved gentle through the cottonwoods, they reached for each other not out of habit but out of love. A love built slow and deep and true. A love that held.